You guys have the opportunity to witness something really special today, and for those of you that have been a part of the program, you've been witnessing something that Lenice has given vision to many years ago. And so when people are coming and telling her, no, you can't do this, no, it's not gonna work out, to actually come to this moment where now we have a room full of people who are also deeply moved and inspired by her vision and what she's been able to do. I not only applaud you, Lenice, and your amazing team, but I applaud all of you. When we see people step into their truth and the greatness, it gives us the license and permission to do ours. So thank you, Lenice. It's been an honor. All right, okay. So I have the opportunity of kind of giving you some opening thoughts to help ground you in what you're about to partake on for the rest of the day. I'll share with all of you, I'm gonna be a little honest, I do not partake in cannabis. It's not something that's personally worked for me in my chemical makeup. That being said though, I do recognize the importance of this emerging market. And in a market that has existed in our communities for a very long time but has been criminalized. So now we have an opportunity to actually legalize it. And so in the work that I do around new economy, there's a growing movement trying to figure out how do we create a new economy that's more just, that's more equitable, that's more sustainable. And what has already started to emerge is those that are wealthier, those that have the leisure capital, those who have the leisure time, those who have the access to the networks are able to capitalize off of a lot of the great ideas that have been coming out of our communities, but we didn't actually have the power, privilege, and resources to do the same thing. And so this is an opportunity to really understand how can this group of people in Oakland continue to make sure that this emerging economy, this emerging market is actually aimed to address the disparities and inequalities that exist between the flatlands and the lowlands. And how can we actually do it in a way in which we provide healing and we restore our communities? So I'm gonna take you through some of my thoughts on that. One of the things I think it's really important, Oh no. Anyway, it's supposed to be a slide that it got messed up. Anyway, so one of the things I think it's important before we start going into how to shape the economy and how to do cannabis and how we're gonna start new businesses is to really root ourselves in the realities of what our communities are coming from. Lenice and Ebli spoke to this a bit in their opening comments, but the quote that was up there was actually a quote from an individual named John Ehrlichman. And John Ehrlichman was the counsel to President Nixon on domestic affairs. And he was quoted as saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or against black people. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, we could break up their meetings, and we could vilify them night after night on the evening news." And so I share with you guys to actually understand the very real context and the systemic pressures that were set up to make sure that particularly black communities were criminalized. Even though data has come out to show that white people actually use hard drugs at a higher rate than communities of color, we still see statistics where I believe was sharing, 76% of the people that are arrested in Oakland in 2013 were black. So these are the disparities that we're up against. And it's important to actually recognize that we have an official making a quote like that because these are the way these practices get codified into our laws. They get codified in a way in which they actually make it legal to oppress us. And we have to be able to know and notice when these things are happening so that we can stop them. And so this piece that Ebli was mentioning, I think it's just really important to understand what we're up against. Even though we have a group of people who are really excited about the promises of the cannabis market, even though we have a city council that is also starting to show some support in passing legislation, we are still dealing with a police force and the policing of our communities that hasn't actually gotten to a place where they also believe that we should decriminalize and actually legalize marijuana use. And so when we think about the statistics of 76% of the people who were arrested for or cited for marijuana use being black, when we only have the 2010 census said only 28% of the folks living in Oakland were black. That was 2010. So we know that because of displacement and gentrification, that number is even lower. So we have a huge gap to make up in terms of how are we actually going to turn things around to make sure that those that are most impacted and most vulnerable benefit from the promises of the marijuana market. And I actually just want to say those stats are from the Hood Incubator's concept paper. It's really good if you haven't read it. Some good data right there. And so this is the other piece to kind of point out. We see the market growing, right? We see it's growing out not only in Oakland, we see it's not growing out only in the state of California, but also nationally, right? And so one of the questions we have to figure out is who gets to benefit from that growth, right? How are we actually positioning communities that haven't had access to the training, the skills, and the networks to actually benefit from a market that's set to grow up to $6.45 billion in 2020 for the state of California. How are we actually figuring out how we use this market to create a really vibrant local economy, right? Really bringing together the vendors, the distributors, the producers, and making sure that our folks get the training, the jobs, and the skills up front to be able to benefit from it. And so in the work that I do, I make it a point to actually break down how the economy works, how systemic oppression works in the economy in 4 different ways, right? So the first is exclusion. We tend to exclude low-income communities of color from being able to have access to good quality education, right? We see this with the shrinking of the Oakland public school system. We denied them access from good quality jobs. The other bit is we control them. We control their ability to move freely. I think one of the most well-known ways that this has happened has been through Jim Crow laws. We actually prohibit their ability to move freely throughout space and time. And then extraction. We extract natural resources out of the earth. We extract labor out of our community. And then accumulation. So the subprime mortgage crisis was a place in which we actually saw when we foreclosed on homes, it created another great contraction of wealth into the wealthier and whiter once again. And so when we're looking at this from the perspective of the cannabis industry, we can point out some of the same pieces, right? We can point out the fact that communities in East and West Oakland haven't had access to good quality jobs, right? They've been excluded out of that labor market. Our children have been excluded out of the schools. And the same with control, right? We say certain communities, you can't have drugs here, so then we concentrate it in other communities like East and West Oakland, and then make it hard for those communities to actually see anything other than drugs, right? And then we drive the police in there as well. So that's how we control the economic controls as it comes to the cannabis industry. And then we extract our young people, right? For a dime sack, we'll send a young one off to CYA. Right? We literally take people out of our communities when they can't get the jobs that they want in the first place. Then we send them away to prison, and then we use prison labor to provide the goods that they can even get the jobs in their community in the first place. So it's really important to understand how this cycle happens. And then lastly, with accumulation, Oakland has come far. I think recently we've seen that it's grown beyond the 8 original dispensaries that were given license to operate. But that was another way in which, if we actually had not been following what was happening, we could have seen another accumulation of wealth, right? So I point this out so we can all just kind of take a moment to be able to name when exclusion, control, extraction, and accumulation are happening as it relates to not only the cannabis market, but markets throughout our communities, right? Other economies, so that we can figure out how do we actually go in, break down what's happening, and do it differently. And so we actually want to be able to go from a place of extraction to regeneration, right? From control to democracy, from exclusion to inclusion, and from accumulation to cooperation. The cannabis industry is a great opportunity to figure out how can we actually do business differently? How do we model for the rest of the local economy here in Oakland and the rest of the country, right? You actually can do business with a good triple bottom line. You can do business that supports people, the environment, and the economy, right? And we can do it by lifting up principles that creates a space for all of us to engage in the process, right? By doing farming practices around our cannabis that actually regenerates the earth and the soil, and by figuring out how do we cooperate with one another. And so we get to think through how we build these principles into our actual business models. And so, one thing I'm gonna go a little touchy-feely with you guys, if you'll bear with me for a second, because I actually think it's really important. I think it's really important to name the fact that the communities that we're really excited and motivated to uplift, these are the communities that are deeply pained and traumatized. These are communities that have been told time and time again that you are worthless, that you do not matter, that your children can be thrown away. And so as exciting as it still is to engage in a new market, we also have to recognize that there's some healing that needs to be done, right? And so there's a way for us to think through how do we create space for healing, to be able to repair our communities from the harm that's been done to them. How do we actually go and acknowledge what has happened, those that have been incarcerated, families that have had exorbitant bail amounts put on them that have actually left them bankrupt? How do we repair those people and make them whole? How do we actually acknowledge their pain and suffering? And then once we're able to actually give space to that, how do we start to identify what are the habits and patterns that got us here in the first place? What are the habits and patterns of extraction, accumulation, exclusion that made it possible for so many young Black and brown people to be incarcerated today? And what do we need to do differently? And in order to do that differently, how can we then embody new practices that we want to lift up in our businesses going forward? And so I share this because the work that we're doing, yes, it's about business, and yes, it's structural, but it's also internal, right? Internal and eternal. We actually get to have a moment to actually reflect on what are the experiences of our families as it relates to the cannabis industry or the war on drugs. How have our families been impacted through generational poverty, generational incarceration, right? And how do we create space for healing so that we can actually go and develop business models that really are directly focused on impacting the most vulnerable and creating new opportunities for our young ones. So I'm done with the touchy-feely. Thank you for letting me have that. And so this is a place where I also think it goes directly into reparations for repair, right? And sometimes reparations, people freak out when they hear the word, and I think people need to really get grounded in what the reality of what that word means. Reparations allows us to once again acknowledge what has been done to our communities, and then it forces us to figure out how do we reconcile and reinvest in those same communities. And I'm not saying necessarily you should go and cut a check to each individual that has been harmed. Granted, I think there's some places where, if you had a bail amount put on your family, you actually may want to compensate that family for what's been done to them, what's been lost. But really figuring out how are we reinvesting resources into the systems that make it possible for people to thrive. And the systems look like healthcare, the systems look like education, the systems look like arts and culture, the things that make it possible for our communities to thrive that have actually been taken from us. So as potential business owners, we get to think through how we not only engage in the local market, but how we may actually reinvest our profits to really aid to some of the reparations and repair that can be done to support our communities. And it doesn't always have to be through profits. It can also be about how do we compensate and train our employees. There's a number of different models, but for us to actually be mindful of how are we trying to restore people and make them whole, and being able to lift up a framework of restorative economics as a way to do that. And so in closing, there's a few things I want to say in terms of what I think is really exciting about what you guys are touching on, right? I think, Brandy spoke to her earlier, her family coming from a farming family, right? We have the opportunity to actually think through how we lift up our own traditional wisdom and practices and embed that into our business models going forward. Because a lot of what people are coming and saying, for impacted communities, that's not new. Right? Our family has been doing that, but how do we actually lift it up in a way in which we get to actually profit and share with other people the wisdom and traditions that we have learned over a period of time? And then how are we also positioning ourselves to be able to challenge systems of oppression? Right? Are we actually ready to have businesses that don't just play neutral, but are ready to speak out when injustices are being done, not only to workers, but to other vendors and to the earth, right? How are we actually using the cannabis industry in Oakland as an opportunity to make it an economy where everyone can thrive? And then also this piece around human development and capacity building. Lenice spoke to this when she was talking about the pre-seed incubator. So for communities that have not had access to meaning meaningful jobs for decades and decades. It's quite a jump to all of a sudden be like, well, we're going to start a business. Right, so for our communities to actually be able to benefit from the cannabis industry, we have to invest in the human development that makes it possible for them to go from someone that's been told no or has been forced to sign the ban the box, and or that they're a felon and they can't get a job, to actually being able to be a business owner, to be a worker owner in a business. And we also have to invest in the capacity building, right? The capacity building for our communities to actually come and sit in this room and understand what's emerging and how do we take a hold of it. And I think a great model is, the sliding scale registration that the Hood Incubator did. We get to think creatively about how we actually make this more accessible and more inclusive for all people. And with that, being able to leverage this moment as an opportunity to get people excited once again about community governance and deep democracy. Right? I mean, we have an electoral process where we have gerrymandering, where we have communities being told that you can't vote or they're shutting down early day registration. It's really hard to get excited about the civic engagement process. But I think that the excitement that we're starting to see around the cannabis industry is an opportunity to really figure out, how do we bring people back to City Hall? Or better than that, how do we actually challenge our elected officials to go back into the communities and engage people around the laws and policies that are starting to be passed that will shape this industry? We actually get to really figure out how we collectivize our power to change things and do it better. And then lastly, really figuring out how are we continuing to leverage this moment to improve and strengthen our social movements so that we can contest for power, right? It always comes back to the ability for communities to organize, collectivize their power, and be able to assert the needs and interests that actually serve their communities. So I'll leave you with some things to consider. As we're developing, as you're pitching your statements or your businesses today, hold on, let me flip my paper. I kind of lifted up some questions that I hope you guys can reflect on throughout the rest of the day. I won't read through all of them, I'll just pick out a few. But you get to think about, what community reinvestment practices will your business follow? Right? Will you decide to take some of your profits and give to a local nonprofit? Will you decide to give your employees days to go and participate in rallies like the May Day March that just happened? How are you continuing to engage with the local community as your business continues to get off the ground and grow? You also get to think through, are you engaged in authentic partnerships with impacted communities? How are you actually getting out to know not only your consumer base, but your neighbors? And what does it look like to have an authentic relationship that moves beyond the transaction of goods to something that's actually transformative? And then how will your local procurement and production practices benefit the local economy? Is there a commitment that's starting to brew in terms of, we're going to engage with local investors, we're going to keep money local, we're going to hire local? I'm not saying these are all the things that you have to do. I'm saying these are some questions that you get to reflect on, as your business continues to grow, as you think about the impact you want to have on your community. And so with that, thanks for letting me do the keynote. I just want to say, go Warriors, and have a good day.